continuing on with this very difficult week. You've got all the justification stuff for the death penalty and now the problem stuff. There's a lot of readings on your As You Learn page. In retrospect, maybe I didn't plan this as well, but this is the part where we talk about some of the problems of the death penalty. Okay. Now I'm going to skip through a lot of this PowerPoint slideshow. I want you to read it on your own because it will just take too long to go through all of it unless we're all together. But you'll see some quotes from some very notable people and organizations in terms of their claims about the death penalty. A couple things you should notice that when the National Coalition to Abolish Death Penalty argues that the death penalty is used against the quote-unquote mentally retarded, that's their terminology, that's no longer legal, and used against minors, that's no longer legal either. Those are both struck down in the 2000s. Okay, but you have quotes from Badeau and Ryman, who are just some of the leading scholars' voices against the death penalty, and most notably Frank Baumgartner, who is a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, a political scientist. He's done an enormous amount of research on the death penalty in North Carolina in particular. But what we're going to look at in a couple videos is the problem. So the possible problems are the political nature of it, confusion and incompetence of juries, the financial costs, the arbitrary and possibly discriminatory nature of it, the threat to the innocent, and if you're interested, we can talk about the human rights element of it in terms of international law. I've written about this, the death penalty under international law. So if you're interested, we can talk about that as well. So starting with the political nature, this may or may not bother you, but it's pretty clear that the death penalty is a political thing. It is a policy created by politicians. When you look at murders who receive the death penalty versus murders that don't, you should be able to distinguish the two based on legal factors, aggravating and mitigating factors, but you can't. And in some cases, it's based on extra legal factors, which are factors outside the law, like race, class, gender. That's when it becomes a problem, okay? But we see that whether a case gets death is determined by the county where the state occurred, or I misspoke, the state where it occurred, the county where the murder occurred, even the region of the country. So you saw 82% of executions occur in the South, right? But more troubling, because you could expect states to do things differently because each has its own jurisdiction, and even counties will do things differently because they have their own different prosecutors. Race of jury and the race of crime victim matters. That's where it becomes problematic. It's what I want you to know is that whether a murder, whether we seek the death penalty in a murder, is up to the discretion of the prosecutor. It's solely up to their discretion. Okay, and you know that Southern prosecutors and prosecutors in Texas, particularly in certain counties, are more likely to seek the death penalty. Right? Now, David Miller, who's an expert on social justice, says that people who live or work in different towns should receive the same outcomes, and so like people who commit the same crime should receive the same outcomes, and we're not seeing that happening. So he would argue that it's not consistent with justice. Okay, that's more of an opinion. Now you'll see a discussion between George Bush and Michael Dukakis in the 1988 presidential debate. This is probably before most of you were born. I'm not sure. Well, yeah, it was before most of you were born, if not all of you. But this is interesting, right? This is who the Republicans and the Democrats nominated to be president. And they were both asked about whether they support the death penalty. And George Bush said yes, and Michael Dukakis said no. And you can see how he said no. And Dukakis lost. Right? You have to be in support of the death penalty. The next George Bush, George W. Bush, and Al Gore in 2000, when asked about their support for the death penalty, they both, Republican and Democrat, said they supported the death penalty, and they cited deterrence. They thought it saved lives. George Bush said it's the only reason to be for it, is deterrence. Now, he was wrong. Right? The evidence suggests it's not a deterrent. But that was his justification for it. Okay. Now, so the politics stuff might not bother you, but we know that people run for office just by the fact that they're supporting the death penalty. So we like to be tough on crime, even though tough on crime doesn't have a large effect on crime reduction. Okay, so that's just evidence from criminology. But it is a political issue that may or may not bother you. Juries are another thing. Juries are meant to protect us from an overzealous and arbitrary prosecution. Juries are meant to protect us from the government. That's why the government has the duty to prove us guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's why you're presumed innocent in trial. A jury of your peers means people like you, people from your community, people that represent your community, who will protect you from an overzealous, unnecessary prosecution. Death sentences now require a jury to recommend a death sentence to the judge before it's imposed. So we need to know if there's problems with capital juries. We know, first of all, that capital juries are conviction prone. We know this. They're more likely to convict. So what happens is if you're opposed to the death penalty and you refuse to consider it, you're not allowed to be on the death penalty case, which makes sense, right? If you're not even going to consider the possibility of sentencing someone to death when the prosecutor's seeking it and they have the right to do it under the law in the state, you're not allowed to be on the jury. So this is death qualification. You're only qualified if you support the death penalty. Well, people that support the death penalty are more conviction prone. So that's problematic. You can also you can also remove people from juries who would automatically impose a death penalty. But the question is, do defense attorneys actually ask that question? Okay, that's an issue. What we know is, before we get into the nuts and bolts of jury problems, we know juries make mistakes. So you'll see slide number 20 in your PowerPoint slideshow, the first one about problems. You'll see that juries make mistakes. From 1976 to 2005, which is the first 30 years of the death penalty, 149 innocent people were removed from death row. Okay, 149. 1,422 were executed. That means for every 9.5 executions, one innocent person was released from death row. Okay. You have another, at that time, another 2,905 were sentenced to death and were on death row. How many of those are innocent? We don't know. Now, we'll get into innocence and what it means. It doesn't necessarily mean factually innocent, okay? But it means significant problems with the case, constitutional violations, so they're not legally guilty, and it could, in fact, and does, in fact, sometimes mean factual innocence. Okay? Here's the nuts and bolts of the jury stuff. It comes from the Capital Jury Project, and this starts on slide number 21 in your PowerPoint slideshow. This was a study sponsored by the National Science Foundation. It's an interview with 1,115 actual jurors, death penalty jurors. They served on 340 different cases in 14 different states. And they found that juries are a major source of arbitrary death sentences. Arbitrary, remember, means random, not based on legal factors. So why does this murderer get the death penalty and this one doesn't? Why is this one sentenced to death and this one's not? It's found to be arbitrary. That's because of juries, at least partly. There's a quote from a scholar who says, there's something fundamentally wrong with the capital punishment system that selects people for execution on a random basis. That's what we do. So imagine if a jury does not understand the difference between aggravating and mitigating factors. Remember, aggravating factors have to outweigh mitigating factors for someone to be sentenced to death. We talked about that in the law unit. And they're supposed to be weighed by the jury. Well, sometimes juries just count them. They don't weigh them. What does weighing them mean? This is not explained. And so if you look across states, you're going to probably see problems with arbitrariness and randomness if jurors are confused about these things. Okay. So here's what we know from the Capital Jury Project. We know that jurors engage in premature decision making. In other words, during the guilt phase of the fight, remember, defendants are tried in bifurcated trials, right? The first trial is whether they're guilty, the second is what do they deserve. We know that during the guilt phase, they're already thinking about giving someone the death penalty. We know that some don't understand juror instructions. We've seen evidence from the study that they don't know how to weigh aggravation and mitigation, which I just mentioned. What I really want to focus on is race and of the juror and race of the victim in the crime. The race of the jury matters tremendously, especially when the murder is interracial. So in other words, like black person kills a white person, that kind of thing. The race of the jury matters in those cases. And the race of the victim matters too, in terms of who they seek the death penalty for and who they don't. So, specifically, the more white jurors you have on your jury, the more likely you are to get a death sentence. So prosecutors use what are called peremptory challenges to eliminate black people from juries, including in North Carolina. Google it. Google North Carolina peremptory challenges race. Okay, it is the news right now. Other than the pandemic and the protests and all that kind of stuff, this has been in the news. Even recently, the Supreme Court just ruled on something related to this in North Carolina. So you're not allowed to eliminate jurors for no reason, just because they're black, but prosecutors are doing it. Okay, and so the more white people you have on your jury, the more likely you are to get a death sentence. When you have a white victim, especially a white female victim, you're far more likely to get a death sentence. So these are some of the problems with the death penalty that we're seeing in the United States. All right, I'm going to stop there. The next video will be longer because we're going to get into some of these problems, but I just wanted to give you a sense of them now. This was just about the politics and the problems with juries, but what it leads to is arbitrariness and innocence and things like that. So that's what the next video